I'd like to welcome everyone to MTRI's January Sit Back Seminar. I'm very pleased to have one of our biggest crowds in a very long time. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting here today in Guestwick, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, homeland of the Mi'kmaq people. I'd like to acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship and thank the Mi'kmaq people for their generosity in sharing their homeland with us. So for anyone who's not aware, the Mercy Tobiatic Research Institute is a research-based nonprofit nestled in southwest Nova Scotia near Kejimkujik National Park and Historic Site. Our mission is to promote, conserve, and sustain biodiversity in Guestwick, as well as beyond into the rest of Canada and the world. Today, I am very pleased to introduce Caitlin Cunningham, Ph.D. candidate at Dalhousie University, and Caitlin is studying the intersection of conservation and urban planning. And her research is focused on better understanding how cities can contribute to meeting broad-scale biodiversity conservation goals. So next, I will be handing over the seminar to Caitlin, but I'd like to remind everyone to please keep your mics muted. And if you have any questions during the talk, you can add them to the chat window, and we will answer them either during the talk or at the end, depending on what Caitlin prefers.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here today talking to all of you. So I'll just share my screen. There, so can you see my presentation now? Cool. Thanks. So I'm going to be talking to you guys today. Okay. So I'm going to be talking to you guys today about some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years on forest connectivity in Nova Scotia, and how we've been able to use that research as a jumping off point to start to identify priority areas for wildlife. So right off the bat, I want to acknowledge that even though I'm the one here speaking tonight, I absolutely did not do this on my own. We had a lot of help by some really wonderful people whose names are up here. Karen Baisley, who's my PhD supervisor at Dalhousie, Peter Bush, John Brazier, and Morgan Rice from Nova Scotia Lands and Forestry, who lended a lot of resources and wisdom to make this project come together. And Leah Fulton, I can't say enough about her. Her technical skills and processing abilities probably cut off about 2 months of work from this project. And it was also funded by Nova Scotia Lands and Forestry. So the focus of our talk today is on forest connectivity. So what is forest connectivity? Well, it's basically how interconnected patches of forest are on the landscape in order to support the movement of plants, animals, and ecological processes. So basically, when we measure and map connectivity, we're looking at how continuous or how broken up or fragmented the forest is. And by looking at these 3 pictures of forest, we can kind of see different degrees of connectivity. So the one on the left is a patch of forest with really high connectivity. It's not broken up by anything. In the center, there's a road that's lowering the connectivity of the forest, but on either side of the road, it still has pretty high connectivity. And on the right, the forest has been broken up into smaller patches that are separate from one another, with farmland in between them. So why is it important to understand and to measure and map forest connectivity? Well, understanding patterns of connectivity can tell us a lot of things. In general, the more connected a landscape is, the healthier the ecosystem is, because natural processes are just able to function normally without a lot of disruption. And we also know that habitat loss is a huge problem for wildlife. As populations become more isolated, the bigger the problem becomes for wildlife and the higher the likelihood of extinction. So a well-connected landscape not only provides more habitat, it also allows for wildlife to move around and to find other sources of food and other resources that they need, and to interact with other populations to increase their genetic diversity. So by mapping connectivity, we can start to paint a picture of where wildlife might be moving and where they face significant barriers on the landscape. So we can start to understand how and where they might be moving and how different management decisions like twinning a highway might impact wildlife movement. And understanding connectivity can also tell us a lot about how a particular landscape might fare under climate change. So generally, the more connected the forest is, the greater the chance that wildlife populations will be able to remain stable through a changing environment. But in some cases, the environment is changing so fast that the only way for species to survive is to move with their habitats. And that's really difficult, if not completely impossible, in a landscape that's highly fragmented. So if there's a lot of barriers like urban development and roads and industrial development in the way, they can't move with their habitat and they'll end up going extinct. Now, when we measure and map forest connectivity, there's two different ways that we can think about it. So first, we can think about structural connectivity, which is how the landscape physically looks. So we would look at things like how close different forest patches are, how big they are, what their shape is, and what's in between them. But there's also functional connectivity, which is how well that structure actually supports wildlife movement or allows for ecosystems to process normally. So the work that I'm going to be talking to you guys about tonight is focused on structural connectivity of Nova Scotia's forests. So we'll be looking at how close together the different patches of forest are. But because functional connectivity is related to structural, we're able to use this research as a starting off point to start to look at the more functional aspects. So when mapping structural connectivity, we often end up thinking about different pieces of the forest as either being a core area, a corridor, or an isolated patch. So we try and identify the core areas, which are the largest pieces of forest that will function as the primary habitat for most wildlife species. And corridors are those that connect the core pieces. Sometimes they're fully connected, which is really nice, but other times we have what we call stepping stones. The smaller pieces of isolated patches, but they're not too far apart, so most wildlife can still use them. Now, sometimes the forest is naturally broken up by things like rivers or wetlands, but a lot of the times what we found is that forest connectivity is impacted by human impacts on the land, like urban development, agriculture, or industrial development. And this work is part of a broader effort to work on building forest connectivity across Eastern North America. In 2016, the governors of the states of New England and the premiers of Eastern Canada signed a resolution on ecological connectivity, adaptation to climate change, and biodiversity conservation. And this work is focused on the Nova Scotia piece of the puzzle. So our goal was to get a better understanding of the state of connectivity of the forests across the province today. Because if we want to work towards better management or even restoring connectivity in the future, the first step is that we have to understand what we have today. So we need a current picture of what's going on today in order to help us better understand what we can do in the future. And it turns out we have a lot of forest in this province. But we also have a lot of roads, which we found were one of the biggest barriers to connectivity in the province. And roads are so prevalent in the province that on average, you're only about 1.8 kilometers away from a road, which is insane. And little over half of the province is within 1 kilometer of a road, and a little over 90% is within 5 kilometers. So why does this matter, though, when we're thinking about connectivity? Well, roads impact the environment and wildlife in a number of different ways. Obviously, they cut through the landscape and create a physical barrier to connectivity because they actually will cut the forest in half. But they also impact their surrounding environment. They change the chemical and the vegetation composition of the area around them, sometimes for hundreds of meters or even up to kilometers. And when we think about wildlife in particular, the effects from roads are really far-reaching. And the presence of a road can cause some species to change their behavior, even if they're kilometers away from a road. So when we were starting to plan out this work, we really wanted in the end for us to be able to use it to tell us something about wildlife movement in the province. So it meant that we had to consider more than just the roads themselves. We had to think about the buffers around these roads where wildlife would still be impacted. So because of this, we looked at the connectivity of the landscape as is, just taking into account the physical structure of the roads, just accounting for where the roads are, plus both a 1 kilometer and a 5 kilometer buffer around them. So looking at the connectivity of just the forests that are further than 1 or 5 kilometers from a road. And when we look at these maps, I really see how much of an impact that roads have had on the landscape of this province. And once we take these buffers into account, we can really see how fragmented the forest is from that perspective. And just with our eyes, we can see that connectivity is going to be low throughout a lot of the province. The 5 kilometer buffer in particular is really eye-opening because it only leaves about 9% of the province left. So why did we choose 1 and 5 kilometers? This was based off of research that was done out of Concordia University in Montreal. They did a global survey of hundreds of different studies that looked at the impacts of roads on wildlife. And they found that a 1 kilometer buffer captures the effects of roads have on most birds and some of the more less sensitive species of mammals, like white-tailed deer. And we chose 5 kilometers because when we looked through their database, we found that captured the effects of most of the species that we have here in the province. Species that are more sensitive to roads and would need an even bigger buffer, like wolves or cougars or lynx, have already been extirpated from the province, or they're confined to really small parts of the province. And in part, our decision was based on the fact that we didn't think we could go any higher. There's so little land left that with 5 kilometers, that if we went much larger than that, there really wouldn't be any forest left for us to run our analyses. And as it stood, the 5 kilometer was pretty tricky for some of the tools that we used, and actually impossible in the case of one of them. And the fact that there are just so many roads in the province, a few people brought up that it kind of suggests that most of the wildlife in the province has already adapted to being around roads. But it's really important to note that just because they've adapted to it, it doesn't mean that they're living in their optimal conditions. So if we manage to increase connectivity and reduce the distances to roads across the province, our wildlife would probably fare a lot better. Now, we also looked at the connectivity of natural ecosystems and mature forests using these same buffers. So today I'm just going to talk about the results of the forest, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about the other ones in our discussion. So there are so many different ways to measure and map connectivity, and I think everybody in this field has their own opinion about which tool is best, and all of them have their strengths and their weaknesses. So what we decided to do was, rather than just picking one, we decided to use multiple tools so that we'd be able to compare them. And the first tool that we used was something that we called a patch analysis. So by comparing the sizes and shapes of forest patches, we can get a sense of how well connected the forest is in different parts of the province. So for example, if patches in a part of the province where patches are larger, on average, it's more likely that connectivity is going to be higher compared to somewhere where the average patch size is quite small. Another thing that we can look at is the length of all of the patch edges in a particular area. So the more edges there are, the more fragmented the forest tends to be and the lower the connectivity. So initially, we decided to look at a whole bunch of different measures across different ways of dividing up the province. So we looked at the province as a whole. We compared the mainland to Cape Breton. We compared the different eco-districts, and we compared the different ecoregions. Now, this approach is really useful from a management perspective because the province tends to manage the forest using these divisions. But it can be a bit tricky to make comparisons between them because they're all different sizes and shapes. So for example, in the Annapolis Valley and along the Fundy Shore, the ecoregions and the eco-districts tend to be really narrow. So the opportunity to just have large patches and a lot of connectivity is just lower than some of the bigger regions like the Western region, which is what covers a lot of Southwest Nova Scotia. So it makes it really difficult to make those comparisons. Because naturally, it's just connectivity is just going to be lower in some parts than others. So what we did was develop a brand new method that would allow us to create continuous surfaces of these metrics. And that let us better pinpoint where changes in connectivity occur in the province. So what we did was divide the province into an even grid, which got rid of the problem of having to compare areas of different sizes and shapes. And then we calculated whatever metric we were looking at for each square of the grid. And we did that 100 times, just moving the grid slightly each time so that it covered a different area. And when we were done doing that 100 times, we took an average of all of those, and that gave us this nice surface of where we were able to pick out where changes in connectivity were occurring. And we were able to find those places where connectivity all of a sudden drops off, where it all of a sudden really increases. So I'll show a few of the results. There were something like 700 maps in this document, but I'm not going to show 700 maps tonight, although it was tempting. So one of the metrics that we looked at was median patch size. So in general, the larger it is, the more connected the landscape is. And what we found in general was that when we increased the size of the road buffer, the median patch size went up, which wasn't overly surprising. So the smaller the buffer or no buffer around the roads is where you tend to have a lot of little patches because they're being continuously broken up by roads. And the bigger the buffer and the further you get away from roads, you have a lot fewer forest patches, but they tend to be a lot larger. We also looked at edge density, which is the length of a patch edge or the border of those patches over a particular area. So we measured it as the meters of edge per hectare. And the higher it is, the more fragmented the landscape tends to be and the lower the connectivity is. And in looking at these maps, you'll notice that some of the eco-districts are blacked out. And that's because a handful of them actually didn't have any forest more than 5 kilometers from a road. But in general, those eco-districts tend to be really narrow. So it wasn't overly surprising, but it also made it a lot more complicated when we were trying to compare across ecoregions. So in general, the edge densities were highest when we didn't account for roads and lowest when we used that 5 kilometer buffer. And this tells us that the further we get away from roads, the more regular the patch shapes are and the less fragmented they tend to be. And that again makes sense because the forests that are going to be harvested are going to be those that are closest to roads. Another metric that we looked at is something called effective mesh size. Now, the last 2 measures that I talked about tell us about forest connectivity between patches, but effective mesh size tells us about within patch connectivity. And it's based on the idea that if 2 randomly chosen points are selected on the landscape, will they be in the same patch or not? So the higher it is, the more connected the landscape is. And we found that the highest values, or the highest effective mesh sizes, were around Keji, the Cape Breton Highlands, and around the North Shore of the Minas Basin. And lowest, they were generally lower around the more populated parts of the province, which was to be expected, like the eastern side of Cape Breton Island and the area around Halifax. And one thing that was really interesting to look at with these surfaces that we created was that it was the only way that we were able to see the low connectivity of the area around Halifax. So instinctively, when you think about connectivity in Halifax or connectivity in Nova Scotia, Halifax generally jumps out in your mind as being this is probably going to be one of the least connected areas. The biggest city, lots of roads, lots of people, lots of development. But Halifax is in one of the larger eco-regions and one of the larger eco-districts. So what ends up happening with a lot of these metrics is that the parts of the city and the really modified landscapes get kind of masked and lost in the data of the more rural parts of the county. So these surfaces allowed us to look at a smaller area and really pinpoint the development and the connectivity or the fragmentation of Halifax, telling us how important it is to look at connectivity through so many different tools and the impact that comparing metrics across different areas and different sizes and shapes can have on your data. Another tool that we used was a program called Circuitscape, which is an open source software package that uses electric circuit theory to predict patterns of connectivity across the landscape. So what you do is you create a layer of your landscape where each part of it is assigned a different resistance value, where the higher the value it is, the harder it is for wildlife to move through it, and the lower, the easier it is. So then you send an electric current through your landscape, and the software finds the path of least resistance. Just like how electricity in a lightning bolt will look for the path of least resistance to the ground. And in the process, it ends up identifying the parts of the landscape where current is able to flow really easily, where it's really well connected, and where movement can occur in all directions. But it also finds those parts of the landscape where the current is more constricted and where it has to flow through just one particular area. So in our case, because we were just looking at the structure of the forest, we gave all of the forested areas a really low resistance and all of the non-forested areas a really high resistance. So the current that was moving through our landscape would be really looking for forests. So once we had that resistance layer, we ran the software and started the current at one side of the province and let it flow to the other. And what we ended up getting was something that looked like this. So to interpret these maps a bit, white areas of the map are where there's no flow, there's going to be no forest, there's really not going to be any wildlife movement, or at least not likely. Blue areas are more diffuse flow, where current is more widespread. Red areas is where the current starts to get more constricted, and yellow is where it's very constricted. So this method allowed us to start to identify some of the key pinch points or points where connectivity is really restricted and there's only a few options for movement. So it pointed out the Digby Neck, which was kind of expected just simply based on its geography. It's a really narrow area to begin with. Same thing with the North Mountain above the valley, again, a pretty narrow spot. Leaving the Chebucto Peninsula just south of Halifax and connections to the rest of the province. From there, there's really only two corridors that it can follow, roughly following either Highway 101 or Highway 103. There's lots of areas of constricted flow on Cape Breton, especially around the Bredor Lakes, Sydney, and the northern reaches of the Highlands, which is half the island. So connectivity on Cape Breton is really dependent on a few key pinch points. And in part, that's a factor of geography. There's so many inlets and peninsulas that it's just going to be naturally constructed, but in part that's also because of the development on the island. So we also ran Circuitscape when we added that 1 kilometer buffer around our road. So that ended up showing a lot more areas of constricted flow. Connectivity is a lot more reduced when we looked at the landscape through this lens. And virtually every area of forest that's left over has a pinch point in it somewhere. And there's not many options for connectivity within this buffer left, but we can generally trace a path from southwest Nova Scotia up to New Brunswick, which is a really important connection to think about from the perspective of wildlife, because that's our only connection to the rest of North America, and for populations to interact with others that aren't in the province. And we did not run Circuitscape for the 5 kilometer buffer. Shouldn't say that I tried, but there just simply isn't enough forest there, and the patches are too isolated to make it work. So the final tool that we looked at was how connectivity has changed over time. And this actually involved using the natural ecosystems analysis. So we assumed that pre-European contact, pre-colonization, that all of the province was natural ecosystems. So we looked at connectivity just assuming that everything was natural. And that was because from our understanding, although the Mi'kmaq people were of course here, they didn't substantially alter the landscape. Like they didn't take part in any large scale burning that happened in other parts of the continent. So although they would have altered the landscape a little bit, their impacts didn't have huge impacts on connectivity. So this shows how effective mesh size has changed over time. And the patterns were really generally the same for all of the patch-based metrics. So in general, connectivity has been best maintained in the southwest part of the province around Keji and in the Cape Breton Highlands. But was really interesting to consider, particularly with southwest Nova Scotia, is that historically, this is actually one of the least connected landscapes. It's one of the most naturally fragmented. So although we think about it today as being kind of our crown jewel of connectivity in the province, that this is one of the best landscapes we have left, historically it was one of the lowest, which was really interesting. And we saw a pretty similar pattern in the Circuitscape results. So a lot of people will say, well, Nova Scotia is a peninsula, it's narrow, it's just naturally going to have low connectivity. But we found that it wasn't really naturally restricted in a lot of places. Really just the Digny Neck and Cape Breton up around what's now Sydney. So that argument that, we're naturally not going to be a highly connected landscape, that fragmentation is just a part of our geography, didn't really seem to hold true. If you talk about in the context of all of North America and maintaining that connection to New Brunswick and the rest of the continent, yeah, that's probably true. But across the province itself, there really aren't very many places where connectivity is naturally restricted. So that was a crash course and a whirlwind tour of a lot of our data and our results. But what was the point of doing all of this, and what does all of that maps tell us? So there were a few key trends in all of the data sets that we looked at. In general, connectivity is higher in Cape Breton compared to the mainland. And unsurprisingly, the forest connectivity was lowest around Halifax and the Highway 103 corridor between Halifax and Truro. It's also pretty restricted in the Shenectady Isthmus, which is, of course, our connection to New Brunswick and the rest of North America. And when we look at where connectivity has been best maintained across the province, Keji and the Tobiatic down in Southwest Nova, as well as the Cape Breton Highlands really stick out. And that brings me to our next key conclusion, was that protected areas are where we consistently found the highest levels of connectivity in the province, particularly the two national parks, Keji and Cape Breton Highlands, which are the largest, of course. And we can also use these results to start to pick out the key corridors for wildlife movement across the province, especially those species that are reliant on the forest. So we're able to start to identify the key corridors that exist, but of course they all have gaps along them. So we can also start to use the results of this research to start to identify where those gaps are, and potentially start to identify key areas for potential restoration or building wildlife crossing structures like the one here that was built, I think it was last fall, along Highway 101. And again, I just want to reiterate that this work just looked at structural connectivity. We just looked at how the forest is physically structured. We didn't have any wildlife data. We didn't look at any actual wildlife movement. But it can be used to help us narrow down where a lot of those wildlife-based studies could be. So for example, on this map here, that yellow line is a least cost path that I found using the Circuitscape data between the Economy River Wilderness area and the New Brunswick border. So that can help us narrow down where along Highway 104 a crossing structure might go. So essentially, while we still can't answer the question of why the moose cross the road, we can start to work to better understand how, and more importantly, where the moose might cross the road. So thank you very much for listening, and I would love to answer your questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was a very interesting talk, really eye-opening. So yes, now we're going to open it up to questions, and there's already some in the chat. So David asks, how is patch defined in relation to developmental/successional stage?
So at this stage for this research, we only considered, so in the forest data that I just showed you, which is what I focused on today, all of the forests were taken the same way. Our mature forests were pulled out we used the proxy of height. The Nova Scotia forest inventory doesn't have an age category. It does have a height category though. So we surveyed a lot of different ecologists in the province and kind of got a consensus that about 12 meters would be a good proxy for mature forests. David's other question is, some wildlife will move through a recent clear cut, some won't. So how do the conclusions relate to different species? So that's would be a step for future research. So with this research, we were just interested in the structural connectivity of the forest. So we didn't take that into account. That would be something that you could build on this research and start to incorporate the needs of individual species. And likewise, do you distinguish different types of roads? No. We just took a general buffer this time. However, that would again be species dependent. So again, we were just trying to look at the general trends in connectivity, but more species specific research would definitely be needed. And yeah, a dirt road is definitely not equivalent to a paved highway. Paved highways are definitely going to have a bigger impact on connectivity from the perspective of from wildlife. Can you make a few comments about mature old forest connectivity? Yeah, it's really low, which was kind of to be expected. mature forest patches tend to be pretty small and fairly isolated from one another. But so the full, this work came out of a full report. And I just dropped the link to it in the chat if anybody is interested. So it was published by the province last fall, and it contains the full data set.
So Melissa asks, first she says, great presentation. Did you use National Road Network data or the Provincial Road Network?
The Provincial. And yeah, as far as I know, they are pretty similar. I think if I'm remembering them correctly, it's been a while since I looked at the national one, but the provincial one has more of the smaller back roads, if I'm remembering it correctly.
I have some questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Why do you think the national parks have more connectivity compared to like Nova Scotia's wilderness areas or nature reserves?
I think they got pulled up in this analysis because they're larger. So a lot of the provincial parks and provincial protected areas tend to be pretty small. So when we're thinking about connectivity, we generally see it more over larger contiguous areas. In particular with Keji, because it's more of a complex, right? Like there's the Tobiatic and other wilderness areas that are right next door to it. So I think that helped. They're also fairly old, so they've had a long history of not being developed, which definitely helps with connectivity.
So David asks, why is Digby Neck considered restrained? Roads, geography, and people are all parallel with very little development.
Yeah, so the Digby Neck is probably one of the only places in the province where connectivity is naturally going to be restrained, and that's because it's very long and narrow. So there just isn't a lot of room in these models that we used. Typically, what we're going to see high connectivity is when you can move in all directions. And if we're thinking about terrestrial connectivity in the Digby Neck, you can't generally move north-south. You can really only move east-west along the neck. Otherwise, you're going to end up in the ocean. So that's really the only part of the province where connectivity is very, very naturally restricted. Yeah. It's more of a factor of just how the landscape actually is,
right?
Versus how we've modified it, which is the case in the rest of the province. Are you using the circuit modeling to get a sense of where habitat management and protection could be considered in the most efficient way? I'm not, but that's definitely something that it could be used for. Yeah, that's definitely would be a useful application of this data. Any comments on how connectivity is increasing or decreasing in the recent past? So this was just a snapshot of connectivity compared, or connectivity as it is now, or as it stood when the Nova Scotia Forest Inventory was created. So we don't really have that fine scale, or that fine kind of on the time scale of what's been going on with connectivity. I think the best way to kind of think about that would be to think about the recent road development and urban sprawl in the province, because those are the two biggest drivers in Nova Scotia. So with roads, we can think about I have twinning highways on my mind because I know it was announced today that several highways are going to be twinned over the next couple of years. And then there's also been a lot of sprawl around Halifax. So those two things would definitely be impacting connectivity in those regions of the province. From Remy, if you wanted to apply your results to identify future protected areas, would you protect the pinch points? Ooh, it's a great question. So protecting the pinch points or the areas with high connectivity. That's a great question, and comes back to the question of whether our conservation systems should take more of a proactive approach to conservation or be more reactive. So if we're taking a more reactive approach, we're looking at what's already been done to the landscape and trying to protect what's left over. So we'd be really focusing our areas or our efforts on pinch points. But if we're being more proactive, we're trying to protect an area before the problems even start. So we'd be more focused on the areas of high connectivity. So I think it's a tough balance between the two. I think in the case of Nova Scotia, we almost have to protect the pinch points because there's so few of them actually left. Particularly, two places really come to mind. Getting off of the Chebucto Peninsula, so connecting that moose population to the rest of the province, and the pinch points that are in the Chignecto Isthmus, connecting Nova Scotia to New Brunswick, are two key areas that I think without protection of those pinch points, we've got a lot of problems for wildlife and conservation more broadly.
So ideally, we'd be protecting both.
Yeah, ideally, can we just put me in charge and I'll protect everything? But yeah, I'm not in charge, and I know that that's not the practical answer. Putting on the government hat, but someday. So,
kind of jumping off that question, what do you think would be the most practical way to increase connectivity the fastest? Do you think it would be preventing forestry from fragmenting anymore? Do you think it would be, keeping our highways single, stopping urban sprawl? Like, what's, I want to say, the cheapest way, the easiest way?
I mean, not twinning the highways is definitely pretty high on my list because that road is already there. Also, not building a lot of new roads. I know it's not a very big road in terms of thinking about provincial level connectivity, but the Burnside connector around Halifax is going to cut off a little bit of connectivity around the city. Yeah, it's kind of a combination of all of those things, right? Like all conservation problems and all ecological problems, these problems really can't be solved with just one measure. They really do require us to think on so many different fronts and to employ all of the different strategies that we have in our toolbox. And really, those are probably the big three in terms of when we think about connectivity in the province: roads, sprawl, and forestry. All of which can be done smarter. It's not to say that we have to completely stop road building or completely stop sprawl or completely stop forestry. All of those things can be done in a way that minimizes the impact. There's going to be an impact, but there's all kinds of design that we can do if we're thinking about suburbs, which is what my thesis is focusing on, is how can we design new development to have the least amount of impact possible. And there's ways that we can lay them out while maintaining as much connectivity as we possibly can. I think road structures would also be a big one, and crossing structures. Again, like the roads that we have already exist, and they're probably not going anywhere, at least the main roads. So helping wildlife to be able to cross those roads and deal with that obstruction will really help.
Do you know the best ways to do that? Like, are they to build like these big Jasper Park kind of huge construction things over the roads, under the roads? Do wildlife tend to use them?
So every study that I've ever seen that looks at the success of these projects has said that they are successful. Whether or not you want to go over or under depends on the species. There are some species that have no problem going under the road. There are others that there are others where they'll start to feel really claustrophobic and can't deal with being closed in, so they need to go over. But I know with the Banff Jasper case, which is probably, I think it's the oldest structure, crossing structure in Canada, they saw species using it before it was even finished, before construction was even finished. And within 10 years, I think the full complement of species in that area was using it. The ones in Nova Scotia are a little bit newer, but I still think they've even seen that they are being used. And the cost is also a big issue, which I see. Of course, Lisa, thank you. Overpasses are 6 times the cost of underpasses. They are often in the 7-figure range to build the overpasses. So we really have to be smart about where we're putting them if we are going to build them at all. And the easiest way to do them, and Lisa, please correct me if I'm wrong, is when you're actually constructing the road, is to make it a part of the construction process rather than trying to modify a road later. Let's see. Could this be done through remote sensing? Yes. And we did consider creating our forest patches through remote sensing. But in the end, the imagery that we had available that we could afford was the same age as the imagery that was used to create the forest inventory in the first place. So we cut our losses and cut our costs just by using the freely available data. But if newer imagery existed, that would definitely be an option. I see a question about riparian connectivity. So we didn't look at that. I would imagine they would be fairly similar, particularly. Yeah, I think they would be fairly similar, at least where the key corridors are, because a lot of times, especially when we're thinking about the parts of the province where there's been a lot of forestry, we tend to leave the forests around riparian areas, around watercourses. It's generally the law. So I think that would be probably still maintained pretty well. I don't know if anybody has looked at it across the entire province. Nobody's coming to mind anyway. Yeah. Riparian areas are also generally heavily favored by a lot of species for movement. They tend to just be natural corridors anyway. So they are really important to maintain.
Okay, last chance for questions, everyone. Okay, well, on that note, I would like to thank the Region of Queens for supporting our seminars and Venture for Canada for supporting my work here at MTRI. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you next month when Hilary Mann, also from Dalhousie University, will be talking about the intersection between society and wildlife and the importance of long-term monitoring and community science. If you'd like to join us then, you can use the exact same link you used tonight, and keep an eye on our social media and your inboxes for the date and time. And yes, thank you, Caitlin, again. And we hope everyone is well, and we get to see you all very soon.
Thank you, everybody.